Awesome wide and worldwide. We will.
We are live.
We are live. All right. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Waitai Coastal-Burwood-Linwood Community Board Information Session workshop on Plan Changes 12 and Plan Change 20. If you'd like to join me in our karakia tematanga. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te hau. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā tātara ki tai. E hiri a ki ana te atakura, e tio, e huka, e apunga, tihe, mauri ora. All right, thanks everybody. So we have a whole team of people here to talk about these plan changes 12 and 20. We've got 2 hours, but just apologies. I may have to leave. Well, I have to leave by 4:15, but if we're still going, then I'll just go and Jackie will take over. All right. Greetings.
Sorry, I'm apology for early departure as well.
Okay.
So they've got 4.
Yeah.
So am I.
All right.
About 3:40.
Okay. Well, if we could start then with plan change 20, the industrial residential interface, so that we because Gary and I are both Linwood members, so obviously that's
None postal here.
and Joe is doing a great job of representing coastal on the coastal side of the table.
Yeah.
All right, so over to you. Just let me, if you want to take questions at any time, just give me a look or pause, because I'm sure there'll be quite a few. So I'll just ask members to kind of hold them and wait until, because it's being a fairly detailed and complex topic.
Yes. Okay, well, we're in your hands a wee bit because we presented, when was it? I can't remember. February. Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you. That's the replay. The replay?
You want to pull the mic down as well?
Kia ora, we presented a month or so ago, I think it was a month ago, goes by quite quickly, and we did run through the presentation or just took you through, or Brittany just went to the main points or areas you were most interested in. So we've got an option, either we could take you through more slowly through the presentation again, or we could just open the floor as to any questions you may have. We can update you. The feedback or the pre-engagement closes today, and it's the Let's Talk website. There's been a number of questions raised, and we've responded to almost all of them. And we could give you a summary about what that general feedback has been, how it's been received, if you like. So I can go straight there and then take you, and we can go through the presentation again. Does that sound? Is that helpful?
Sorry, I just got message through and I got distracted, and that's very terrible cheering.
Just say yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, okay. So in general, the feedback has been, we particularly were seeking input from the industrial landowners that would be most impacted by the plan change. And unsurprising, there has been quite strong feedback to say that the proposed rules would significantly impact their existing operations. There's been quite a few questions around existing use rights, and I will need to, we may have to go to the RMA reform announcements, because there is a matter there that was announced by the Minister on Friday that does have a bearing on this plan change, that we do need to consider how that might impact this plan change, particularly some of the rules that have been drafted. So the feedback, I mean, the main points, as I mentioned, was it would have an impact on the operations, and there was quite a lot of concern with the fact that it would impose costs, could lead to loss of employment in some instances, and would seriously or quite significantly compromise development opportunities on the site. So, and actually give rise to some unintended consequences, particularly around the noise rule and bringing in special audible characteristics. So so we need to work through that feedback from the industrial landowners. There's quite a lot there, particularly we'll need to, which we were already in train doing, is in our Section 32 assessment evaluation of the costs and benefits. We'll need to ensure that that Section 32 is robust in terms of the economic impact on existing activities, and as much as possible quantify that. So the matters have been raised, it's our responsibility to respond to that feedback, and that will require more work. The economic assessments to date haven't been undertaken to the level that we would need to advance the plan change. Just to note, this is a draft. That's the whole purpose of draft, is to go out there and get this feedback, so then we can design or ensure that the Section 32 can then move to the next stage, and we can target some of these particular areas of concerns. One factor around existing use rights, we have prepared a fact sheet. Is that down live?
I think tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
This week, definitely.
This week. So we've spent a bit of time with our legal team as well, making sure that that fact sheet is correct legally in terms of existing use rights. But I will raise the fact that the government has signalled a potential change to existing use rights under the RMA reform, and I'll just come back to that, but it's quite important because it impacts this plan change, because this plan change and how existing use rights apply and what any new rules will have to take account, or in time we may, for example, go through this plan change process and then 6 months later be required to change the rules again. So that is something that we need to work through. We don't have an answer. We just don't know. We just have, we heard it on Friday. We need to think it through. We need to talk through with our legal team and as to how that does impact this plan change and some of the rules that have been drafted. Again, we don't know how that's going to impact the time frame for this plan change, and we might need to put forward some options about the more controversial rules compared to those which have generally found some reasonable support. And that includes from industrial property owners. For example, I think everybody's generally comfortable with a height rule to storage, outdoor storage. So there's things which aren't as contested as other areas. So we might need to put forward options as to whether the plan change, what rules might be at risk from being impacted by the RMA reforms, and what ones which we think have a pretty much a clear pathway to being supported through the Section 32 assessment. So that's where we're at. We do need to revise the time frame, because we just do not believe we can get that economic assessment and that level of responding to that feedback in the time frame that we originally put forward, which was going to be, I think, May. So we might need to come back and just update you on what a revised time frame may be. And the next aspect is, if you've got any questions around that, we could then potentially go to some other. Take you through.
Question from Greg and then Yanni.
With the pre-engagement, you said that come back and saying increased costs is an issue, and it's a real easy thing to hide behind. Did any of them actually say what those costs would be, or just a blanket, it's an increased cost?
I haven't read the detail of the feedback, but at this stage, it's just more general, isn't it?
Yeah, some are specific. Like they'll give specific examples, like putting in more trees, and for their site, what that would mean for them, particularly larger sites where they would need a lot of trees, and it just doesn't make sense to them to be putting in so many trees in industrial land. That's one example. Another one is for the generation of heavy vehicles and how it would make their business impractical. So there are some quite helpful feedback where it is very specific, and we can sort of grasp the effects in that way, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yanni?
Yeah, everyone wants a breakdown of the percentage of the engagement where it's come from businesses, industry who want less, and residents or community who want more.
So our next step is to summarise that feedback and look into that detail.
I guess I'm just concerned that industry obviously have a lot of resources with which to engage. I guess I'm just concerned that we we may need to do more engagement around local communities. Obviously it's been a really busy.
Oh, here we go, he's Anna.
Plan as well, so,
Yeah.
you know, it's just, there's been so many different things going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just kind of keen to know, yeah, so obviously it'd be good to keep that.
It's more professional. Yeah, so over 50% of the feedback that we've got so far is from individuals. And in terms of what we're hearing, it's kind of like, it's not a numbers game, right? We're not saying, okay, we're here for more businesses and their concerns are this, therefore that outweighs the residents. What we've heard from residents is pretty consistent with what we thought were the concerns. So in terms of noises at certain times, etc. And we will give a breakdown of what we heard when consultation closes. So kind of the point of this engagement was, yes, to hear that and just make sure our thinking's right, but also to hear the flip side, which has been less apparent to us until now. So what the concerns might be from businesses, industrial stakeholders.
Right, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess when we'll see the data, but but if we're concerned that there's groups that we haven't heard from, then we've got the ability to go out and seek more information, right?
100%, yeah.
Part of this engagement process.
Yeah. And it's step one as well. So when we notify, we can make sure that we're making sure that everyone impacted by
I
it.
guess probably one of my biggest concerns is that, and I think the board struggled with this as well, is that because we're not planners, it's really hard to know what the proposed rules, the difference that they will make. And so I just wonder if people are sufficiently aware of what the rules implications will be in the community. Right, and I know we've asked about noise, for example, but I haven't received anything back, I don't think, on noise. But
What are you specifically meaning, sorry?
so for example, the proposed limits in the plan change, my understanding is that they would barely make any difference at all to the existing complaints that we're getting because of the way they've been set. So actually, although we might be bringing in new noise limits, in terms of the things that's causing a nuisance to people and impacting on their quality of life, they would actually do very little to change that. Not from the existing operation, just if you look at the existing operation and the proposed noise level, if they went somewhere else, that wouldn't actually mitigate the concerns.
Okay, so, and yet, sorry, it's the special characteristics are ones that because what we've found of that when, you know, the noise is measured is usually, often I should say, it's the special characteristics of vibration. So I'm very interested in what industry is saying in terms of unintended consequences, because it is another one of those things that, as well as additional costs that is easy to kind of hide behind. Can you give us any examples of what people said? Because I'm very interested.
We can. The activity for this is where existing use rights is very important, because any activity, including the bangs and clangs, might be deemed part of an existing use. However, it is very, very difficult to potentially, this is the advice given from our enforcement officers, to even establish existing use rights for bangs, clangs and thumps, because it's in part associated with that existing activity on site. The concern, therefore, has been that existing businesses are concerned that the new rule would prevent them from undertaking their existing activity, because that currently generates bangs, clangs and thumps. And then the new rule would therefore impose a cost on them, because they would need to provide some mitigation in place. So that is the potential impact. So they believe that they wouldn't be able to meet, say, their existing resource consent conditions. It would create a non-compliance, and that would have a cost on them as a business to mitigate that noise.
But regardless of what the concern is over either existing activities or actually new proposed activities. The concern that I'm trying to express is that the proposed limit, if you looked at the majority of complaints that we've had around some of the activities, the proposed limits are so high that they actually wouldn't stop that from being compliant.
So the limits are based on New Zealand standards, the noise limits.
Yeah.
So they are a consistent, the current operative plan is consistent with national standards and consistent with how industrial areas are managed up and down the country. So they're not, I couldn't actually agree that they're low. In other words, the noise standards are too enabling.
After our last meeting.
Yep.
And got a briefing on it, and I asked a specific question. If the proposed limit was introduced, how many of the existing complaints would be substantiated versus not? And the answer was very few. So I just, yeah, I get what you're saying about New Zealand standards, and I get what you're saying about, you know, the limits, but just from a public's point of view, my concern is to understand what we're proposing, that people understand the difference that it will or will not make in terms of the level that we're setting.
And I guess I understand where you're coming from, I guess what I was interested in is that you have the decibel limit, right? But that sits alongside these special characteristics. And what is my understanding from last time and from the discussions is that what's going to affect the public in terms of reduced noise generally is the special characteristics, is it with the special characteristics rather than the actual decibel limit?
Correct.
Because decibel limit it's been very hard to substantiate across the boundary. And what people experience as the noise is actually mostly those special characteristics.
So what's the limit for the special characteristics? My understanding is that LBQ 50.
It's a penalty, so it's additional to whatever the noise limit is. So if it's a 55 limit and you're found to have special audible characteristics from your noise source, that's where it will change by 5 decibels. And it's per noise source as well.
It would be more, it's stricter if the activity has the potential to generate special audible characteristics, then their penalty is applied and they have a lower noise limit that they would need to meet under the draft rules. And that is what's concerning the industrial landowners, because they believe that they will not be able to undertake their activities on site and achieve that. So it would impact their operation.
Yeah, but if we had an idea of the complaints that we received and when we've gone and monitored, we would know what level that's going to be at. So can we tell what with the 5 decibel penalty, how many of those complaints that we've monitored have been either above or below?
Because we don't know what the special characteristics were.
Yes.
Because we didn't record them, because we don't have, they're not going to record them if there's no way to enforce it.
Correct.
So it's annoying not to have the information, but we just don't have it.
There could be some information. So if the complaint has the detail about what type of noise, where it's been generated from, and they'll say what noise they're generating, could potentially look back at it. That's what our acoustic engineering services advice has done. They've looked at a bunch of sample complaints and sort of helped us see what ones might have special audible characteristics as relevant. Yeah.
But we would, if you wanted a full and complete picture, that would require us to essentially assess every site along the interface and determine, we can use the the complaints information as a starting point, but if we would want, in a sense, create a baseline, we would need to do a lot more further work, because it's the only time special noise our enforcement officers are out there is when there is a complaint, and then a lot of the complaints actually found them to be compliant with the noise standards. And sometimes when it's non-compliant, there would be some conversations had and they would move a piece of machinery, or they would try and mitigate it as much as possible on site.
Is it so? What I was hoping that we would get, so that people could understand, was just like a one pager on the noise, how we can measure the noise, what the proposal means in terms of.
We can provide some more information about that,
Yeah.
maybe
and
a
what
information sheet.
as well, so that we can definitely see it in the New Zealand context.
Yes, in comparison with other councils, we would be more, under these draft rules, potentially more restrictive, wouldn't you're slightly
yeah.
more restrictive than other councils. And that is again, the concern raised by the industrial landowners.
And Kelly has been waiting for a question.
I have. Yeah, is this type of activity different from commercial activity like at the Palms, for instance, where they had a, I guess, a event going above 50 decibels for hours on end, and that had to be mitigated by the Palms. So you saying that it's a higher threshold? It's sort of 55.
Yes, it depends on the noise source. So when mechanical ventilation or possibly that example or a refrigeration, that's a constant noise and it's much easier to measure and require mitigation to bring it to acceptable levels. They can do various things to achieve that. Special audible characteristics are much more complex because they fluctuate, they're inconsistent, it's very difficult to manage them.
Would be like the dropping of a
container.
Yeah, okay. So which is similar to residential, because I think we may have talked before about a chap who uses a bandsaw.
Yes.
And it's only, I guess, prosecutable if he uses it for periods of 15 minutes or more. And then if he stops for 5 minutes and starts again, he doesn't actually fit the criteria for, so that's the sort of scenario you're talking about. So someone would virtually need to be on there all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
a bit like fireworks,
Yes.
because some are very loud for very short periods of time. But in actual fact, it's not kind of cumulative.
Yes.
You like?
So the way we try and manage activities or currently manage activities is a combination of managing what's permitted and what's controlled under a plan. And it's really at the point an activity is established that you have the most opportunity to ensure that the site is designed. It's really, a lot of this can be resolved through site design. So say they're redeveloping the site. This is where the opportunity with this plan change is. Actually, you're quite right. It's probably not going to solve, it's very difficult to solve the existing problems of today. But as a site's redeveloped, it's at that point that if the rules are set right, we might consider a controlled activity, for example, where you can't decline the application, but you can make sure the fact that you can design the site, such as putting buildings along the interface. That's actually a great way of addressing noise, because then you've just got a visual impact and not a noise one. And that can contain sometimes resolve a lot of the problems is when that site is developed. Or you can make sure the fact that they only use one access, for example, for staff, and actually all the heavy vehicles or the actually visualises a different access. So that's at those points, that's the opportunity, this plan change, is to say, well, when that site's redeveloped, we're going to try and make sure that the rules are going to achieve a better outcome. And that's really what we're trying to achieve, but getting those rules set right to be able to achieve that. And what's the best way of doing it? Is a noise rule really, with special audible characteristics, going to be as effective as potentially managing site layout? So those are that's when we come down to the cost benefit assessment, that we really need to make sure the fact that is really robust, that we can defend a new noise rule. And at the moment, that seems to be a lot of tension around how that noise rule might work in practice.
So if you say in a case like Portland, if the way is if the review done, are they still able to operate under their existing resource consent,
Yes.
etc.?
Yes.
And so any new work is not likely to substantially change the requirements that they had to I guess, to fill initially. So it's not like a new overlay. that
No.
they would, apply for. the
Well,
criteria.
That's where existing use rights is very clear because they have a resource consent and they can actually demonstrate that that is their permitted activity. So they, in that instance, it can be quite clear that they would have to change the scale under the current resource management section. They would have to change the scale and character and nature of the activity for that existing use rights, including their consented activity, not to apply. But as I mentioned before, there are signals that that existing use rights is going to potentially change. We are very unclear about how the Act may change because it was signalled the fact that existing use rights may allow some expansion, whereas currently under the Act, there's no expansion allowed. So we really don't, again, coming back to this plan change, understand the implications of that RMA reform.
Cool, thanks. Any other questions? Joe?
As there might be some change, do you think it's better to pause this for a while?
We're going to consider consider what the options are. As I mentioned before, one approach could be to not pursue those parts of the draft plan change rules which are more contentious and may be impacted more so by the RMA reforms, and just focus in where we think that there can be some justification at this stage or less impacted rules, and I guess narrow the scope potentially of the plan change. Just to note also that we have had some requests for us to consider the rezoning of some industrial sites. So we still will bring that again back for feedback, but there are definite requests. There's certain requests for some spot zonings to change from industrial general to say residential mostly, or another zone change. So we will bring those through because they actually may resolve some interface around the city. So that's another part. Again, we just need more time to work through those zone changes because we haven't actually undertaken a Section 32 assessment of any zone changes. But so that again, in terms of the scope of the plan change, I think it's safe to say we'll be bringing it back in a different form or some options that you may want to consider.
Thank you.
Joe?
So I was just trying to, in terms of the idea that some activities we've just got wrongly categorised in industrial general that should be in industrial heavy, is that still likely in terms of the feedback we've had to be a thing that we can do as a quick one?
Have to look at the feedback in more detail. I don't think we've had a chance to. Wouldn't know off the top of my head.
No,
No.
not yet. We can probably go through it.
But generally, the idea, regardless of existing use rights or the noise stuff, the proposal is basically seeking to shift some activities that are currently allowed for in industrial general into industrial heavy, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Has there been any issues raised around transport? You talked about the heavy vehicles. What assessment have we done around the impact of heavy vehicles from these industrial developments? I guess noting that, like for Kenaway, for example, most of the improvements that they were required to do, they didn't actually end up doing. So the community is still paying the price, and council had to actually fund the cycleway that the developers were supposed to fund originally.
Is that to do with the resource consent conditions?
The outline development plan.
The outline development plan.
And the conditions around the plan change when it went through had very specific transport requirements. And then effectively once the plan change was approved, the developers came back to council and said, we don't believe we should have to do this. And obviously the board agreed to put yellow lines down instead of do the cycleway safety issue. I was just interested in that traffic generation. You said it was one of the things that you're getting some feedback on. And I just was trying to understand a little bit more about the practicalities of what we're proposing and why it would be different.
So we have had feedback sort of on both sides. the businesses concerned about the operation and what that would mean. And then on the side of residents, how there are ongoing issues with certain roads due to heavy trips, and just so many. Yeah.
Any other questions about plan change 20?
Did you get any feedback on the environmental effects? The chopping down of trees, the destruction of the ecology, the encroachment into things like river corridors? Is there any?
We've had at least one question about that. Perhaps if there's any others.
Okay. Do you think we've done a sufficient assessment of the ecological impacts?
I'd say there hasn't been enough time at this point.
How could we get that considered? Like, I'm just wondering what's happening at the Fort Link site with the lizards. There's kind of this weird kind of outcome where the development gets permission, but then there's this thing with the lizards that means that conditions that are required are then really difficult to implement, and therefore new conditions come in which are worse for the residents but better for the lizards and probably better for the company. So just trying to understand, like, in terms of a hierarchy, around how we can kind of look at
The plan change, that's more a resource consent matter rather than the plan change. The plan change, we have setback requirements under the district plan. They have to be followed unless they go through a resource consent, at which point I suppose that's a point at which the resource consent needed to address that matter or any issues raised. So I can't comment on that.
It's the shortcoming, from our perspective, it's a shortcoming of the RMA and the resource consent process, in that the fact that adherence to the existing rules doesn't count when it comes to this assessing a resource consent. I mean, it's the same story, different day.
But I guess it's whether we think we should adopt more of a precautionary principle rather than the damage gets done and then we have to try and retrospectively fix it. So I guess around that precautionary principle around the environmental impact or the ecological impact ahead of a consent being issued, whether there's enough thought going into that, particularly when you do have generally adjacent to residential, you generally have that higher level of environmental amenity.
So in terms of environmental standards, as I mentioned, the plan has rules in place. It goes through, that's when all the evidence is weighed up and a decision is made. And I can't comment on that. In terms of, we would have to see whether the rules, and we'd have to take more time and assess how effective the rules are, particularly setbacks from waterways. I do think there has been a matter raised on occasion and how the waterway setback is measured, where it's measured from. So there are some matters, but in terms of ecological, that was all the rules, the right setbacks, that was all tested through the previous district plan review. So we would have to develop some monitoring or have an evidence base to actually, before we could justify any change to the rules.
In terms of, before we move on to the next plan change, in terms of the consultation on, because we've done the pre-consultation was just about to finish, and you'll amend the draft accordingly, and then when it goes out for a special consultative procedure, how much can it change in response to feedback? And so anyone can, I'm just thinking out loud, so anyone can any member of the public can make, or affected party can make a submission, and then the plan can be amended. But you mentioned something last time about how the pre-consultation is important because you can only change it so much.
Before the proposal, correct.
Before the proposal. Yeah.
That's why I mentioned the word scope of a plan change. So it's important. This is why this feedback pre-engagement is so important to how these plan changes are done, because they're identifying issues, but they help us refine the proposed plan change itself. In other words, the policy and the rules. And once you notify something, that limits the scope of a plan change. So you can't just then bring in and propose to introduce a new rule or a new zoning. It needs to be on the plan change. Now, there's lots of tests through law about how much scope, and sometimes there's a little bit of wriggle room, but really it is quite narrowed. So yes, that's why this feedback is important, and that's why we, nothing stops us continuing on with engagement either. If there's particular parts of that we really think we need to think this through more, we need to talk more, we need to discuss it more, we need to seek some more feedback. That's what this whole point is to making sure that we go out and continue. So again, the time frame, once we have considered the feedback, we'll consider whether we need more engagement and then signal that as well.
So, and are there any, given that the low information nature of some of the affected communities, residential communities, and I guess, a bunch of small businesses that might not have much of administration services and that kind of thing, is there anything additional or different that we're going to be doing in terms of the consultation process, or is that something we can do some more work on?
That's something we can do some more work on. So once we have an updated plan, then we'll make tactics, etc., that will do our best effort to target who we need to. So that could include a webinar or drop-in sessions for people who need maybe more face-to-face explanation. Yeah, and we're happy to take any feedback on that. But yeah, so given the scope of the discussion, we'll create tactics accordingly.
Okay, cool. So are we going to have the chance to feed into that before it happens?
So we're going to talk to you again about what we've heard through consultation, through early engagement, and the next steps. So yeah, at that point,
okay,
absolutely.
No, that sounds good. Just if you have a final question before we.
Yeah, I mean, just a feedback. Well, one area that I'm really interested in hearing from would probably be the schools. We've had a number of schools within the Boards area that have had adverse effects of the industrial activities in close proximity to residential. So Phillipstown School, and I know it no longer exists, but there was a joinery factory, I think, that was outputting, and there was a bit of an issue between ECAN in terms of discharge consents and council in terms of land use consents. So I would just think that hearing from the schools, and Bromley School's the other one where they had a gas, it was some sort of gas thing, where they shut down for a couple of days. So
yeah, we can put them on a stakeholder list.
Yeah.
When we send an email to you prior to consultation going live, we typically have a line on it that says if there's anyone that you'd like us to target to make you comfortable making a decision, let us know.
Yeah,
that's exactly.
So that to me would be important. And just the other thing is just understanding where ECAN fits in around some of the discharge stuff as well, whether there's been anything considered just in discussion with ECAN around joint consenting, or because some of the complaints have been the stormwater ones, the classic for the wreckers in Garland's Road, where council looks at it, says it's fine, ECAN looks at it and says you need 6 consents, and people just scratch their head and go, I don't understand this.
Yes.
Or the methyl bromide that was being discharged, for example, where council gave a land use consent, but they didn't have a air discharge consent, so they were allowed to just discharge methyl bromide without a consent, which seems pretty extraordinary.
So there's instances in the past that I'm aware where joint hearings can be held with Environment Canterbury and the city at the same table. And then they hear it together and then go away, make their separate decisions because they've got different jurisdiction. And then, but there's other times when the applicant may seek a land use consent separate from a discharge consent. So there's mixed approaches there. And certainly I think when sometimes hearings are held together, that is beneficial, have a lot of benefits, but it's not always the case. And often council doesn't have the ability to require that either, because it's just when an application that's required to process it once it's lodged.
We don't have a unitary plan, so we don't.
Yes.
Yeah. Although we might get them imposed on us. Yeah. All right, well, thanks everyone. So just check, other than me and Yanni, does anyone have any questions about the PC20? No, all right, well, let's move on to PC12 then. Right. Any staff involved with PC12, welcome to join us.
I think I did get through the full presentation previously. So again, I've just seen the floor as to whether you have any questions or you want me to run through that. There are some updates in terms of our approach. I can focus in on the engagement side if that's maybe wanted to discuss more.
Sounds good.
Okay, all right. So the engagement aspect, we have been meeting internally, recognising the fact that the community, there's a lot going on, and always is. There's the adaptation planning, there's this plan change, there's updated information that's been required on LIMS, and there's tsunami management aspects. So we met recently. There is actually a information session, council information session tomorrow on tsunami. I think it's at 9 o'clock. 9:30. And so John Fussell, I expect, will be updating on the next steps for tsunami warnings. But we recognise the fact that putting the projects aside, there's some common information or common messaging that we could focus on as a first part, and the plan change being part of that, because it's just updating maybe on the hazard information. It could be a session on understanding risk a bit more. So there could be some common themes across our projects that address coastal hazard and risk management. So we're looking at how we might have a more joined up approach to engagement. And so we don't have any more information on that, what that may end up being, except to say the fact that that's the general way we're wanting to travel. And when we have more information, we will come back to you. In the meantime, Plan Change 12 does have to continue to progress, so there will be some engagement that we will need to do at some point. The timing of that is particularly important here. We are signalling that and the feedback we're getting is to take our time on Plan Change 12. And so we do, whilst we're aiming for September to have a draft plan change, that will need to be flexible, because we'll need the engagement and the involvement of the community and most impacted stakeholders. We need time and to develop that engagement. So, and it's important. The other part of that is I mentioned in the presentation about an infrastructure assessment. So this infrastructure assessment, we have scoped it, and we're currently, it's going to be quite a major piece of work, and it's really just trying to understand. We know what infrastructure will be vulnerable, but we don't know what that actually means. Does that mean if it's vulnerable and it's failing, how is that going to actually impact land use activities? So that there is a very, very big infrastructure assessment, and we're just at the stage of procuring that, but that will actually take most of the year to complete too, because it's quite a big exercise. But that's very, very important to inform the plan change, because that infrastructure is inherently linked to land use enablement or land use activity. So we need to progress that. That's going to take a lot of staff time and input to support that work. And then alongside that, as we work through that infrastructure assessment, there is the integrated assessment approach, and that's where it's called an integrated assessment, but really it's very much a process. So at the end, we will have an assessment that will help inform and support the Section 32, but really it's about the process. So this is where we begin to have discussions with impacted people and impacted businesses and community groups and different and test test what the issues are, what can be solved through a plan change and what can't. We'll be identifying not just the issues but options. So actually working with about identifying, and we mentioned there more of a trigger-based approach through the plan change. So actually wanting to discuss what does that mean, how would that manage activities as opposed to just making things non-compliant, for example. So just testing that out and actually getting more feedback or better understanding about the socioeconomic impacts. Again, it comes back to that Section 32 needing to be really robust before we propose any new provisions. So that draft scope or proposed approach is
it's sitting around intent.
yes.
So soon, we're just waiting.
Okay, so it's drafted, that scope of the proposed approach, let's just call it the integrated assessment approach. That is drafted, it's going internally to get feedback from other staff, and particularly our engagement team, our governance team, to actually get feedback. Then we'll bring that back and then be able to share that. And that will just set out why we're proposing this approach. It's I suppose, an expanded or a more in-depth engagement approach as opposed to other plan changes where we might take less time. This is certainly going to take longer. It's going to involve a lot more steps. Do you want to, some of the steps would be focus groups and
focus groups. I guess this is ultimately an impact assessment, but we need to understand from a community perspective in particular how to assess the impacts of this plan change. So it will involve coming up with criteria with the community. So understanding sort of what impacts are of a concern to the people who will be impacted, if that makes sense. So that will be a big part of the process, is coming up with criteria to assess each option and change, and out of that should come robust evidence that can feed into Section 32.
And I suppose the difference here is that some of those criteria may be less, they don't have to be strictly resource management type environmental criteria. They could be, for example, impact on a school's catchment. I mean, it can be more socioeconomic. We're particularly looking at those criteria rather than ones we know well as to they might be more of an environmental standard or something. This is other criteria. You can only really develop that with the community to make sure the fact that it's also something that is understandable as well, because it's quite complex. And we haven't had many examples. They're only integrated assessments. We did one through the urban development strategy way many years ago. An integrated assessment was also undertaken for the Otakaro Avon River corridor, so that regeneration plan. So that was that's two I know of, but I don't know of that many others that have been undertaken in this manner. So it is a broader, all four well-beings type assessment.
Joe had a question, and Celeste.
Okay, working with the communities, are you just going to work with a community, a smaller group of representatives, or the whole community?
That is something we still both, as much, targeting as many people and groups and perspectives as possible. That is the ultimate goal. How we can achieve that, who's interested, who's able, how do we support that involvement, making it much more accessible, easier for people to get involved, breaking the communication, the conversation down to bite sizes. That's something that's been fed back to us. Break it down. These processes are very, very complex. Planning can be just overwhelming. So it's even working, trying to work out how do we do that. It needs a lot of thought, a lot of involvement, even to advise that. The scope that we've done is really just saying, hey, we need to do it that way. We don't want to do it the standard way. We need to do it this way. But actually designing all of that, that's where the governance team and the engagement, the comms team, really, that's.
Yeah, I can understand.
Oh, here we go.
But given that each community is different.
Yes.
And has different, impacts. We've really got to take our time to manage that and work through the process, but is it gonna tie in with chat?
Well, that's the ultimate aim. So we've been aware for a little while now exactly how much we're about to hit your communities with. It's not ideal, and we are doing some very, very careful thinking about how we manage that. And Sarah was talking about time frames and that sort of thing. It's a really important part of it. When does all of this information start to hit the community? What are the key messages that sit across that? So it's not lots of little disparate kind of very science-heavy information coming at them with a lot of hard-hitting kind of information. We want it to be one conversation, if possible, that is about the future of this area and what that looks like and how they can be part of shaping that. So your question previously around, are we talking to some key groups or are we talking to deeper into the community? We're very much going to listen to those advocates around what is appropriate for that specific community, because as you said, they're all different. Some of them are very well represented and feel well represented. Others are maybe represented, but they don't feel that's who represents them. And in other areas, there isn't that representation at all, and we will need to go a little bit deeper. So each step of the way, in an ideal world, we're going to be checking in with the community, with yourselves, and just making sure we're going to be very careful.
And
This is going to be a slow.
and you're doing it. Sorry. I understand that you are in contact with Sarah Mackay, who's doing a bit of work for us out there in the community, trying to, I think she'll be getting information and contacts that will be really important. Sorry, back to you, Jen.
Yeah, sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Sorry, I was scared I'd lose
At the
mine.
moment, the concern I'm hearing is that there's a lot of grey area in between what the wellbeing approach is as to the actual planning approach. And, we might say that we will look at each case individually, but what is the certainty? And that is the grey area that a lot of people are giving feedback about. So I think it's really important to take time and get this right. Yeah, thank you.
Celeste?
Thank you. It's complex. That I'm not a planner. It's sort of beyond me a lot of it. But in terms of the is there a point we'll get like a summary of like each stage of the process? Because at the moment it feels very like there's a lot of work to do, and I appreciate how much work you're doing behind the scenes. But whenever I hear the September, I know that maybe being pushed out, but it gives me
Or not in my ideal world.
Okay, so that's not,
no. So I don't speak with any authority on this, but I see this as an 18-month to 3 year
that's I'm thinking this is like an 18 months to 2 year process, and yet September's been mentioned, and I'm thinking we've got the elections, nothing happens for 3 months.
No. September was given at a point in time, but certainly my advice going out, and this is some of the work that, ideally we have a nice A3 of all the programs and work that's been a map. I say a map, but I mean a timeframe map showing and really based around, as Tessa said, around the messaging of all the discussion points. Let's say it's not just it's messaging, but it's also what are the key discussion points. Putting the project, whether it's adaptation planning or district planning aside, put that aside, or emergency management. This is just some of the conversations we need to have along the way, because so we are definitely I can see things are getting drafted at the moment and shared around. So I think there's a lot of movement, and I think just keeping the momentum to feed back to you as well, to actually say where are we at, not actually just holding back. I think waiting for everything to be, if you can just take everything as a draft or a feedback, because sometimes we might wait until we're trying to get it perfect, but maybe it'll never be perfect work.
And that would be my feedback as well, is that actually I appreciate the approach, which is very open and flexible, because I think it has to be, because
as you said, we haven't done this much before, this
Mm.
their approach, and how do we know what?
Yeah.
We're testing it out as we go.
We are
And
testing.
I think community trust that when they know that they get real buy-in to the process and they can go, well, here's a bit of feedback at this early stage, rather than waiting till it's perfect and then trying to give feedback, which we know
Yeah.
much harder
Yeah.
to influence the outcome. So that, I had a lot of questions, but I actually think it's still too early to ask them. So maybe my only bit of feedback would be, sounds like the right approach. Appreciate the thought that's gone into it, and I'm relieved to hear that there's more time. And also, could we, if there are drafts of things that you need input on, are we able to look at those at some point?
Yes.
Not necessarily anything specific,
So
but
that-
like
that's-
the how rather than the what.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So we've got it's, as I said, the first thing will be that scope to do the integrated assessment.
Yeah.
That will actually give you a lot more background to, and hopefully demonstrate, yes, we have been listening. We are trying to make sure that this is not going to take a standard process. We are trying, to shape that. So that's what that does, and sort of begins to draft out what those key steps in the process are. So that was the first document. So I hope that will be, I've been saying this for quite a while, but I hope that will come to you sooner than later. And then, so that's one aspect. And the other aspect will be the bite sizes of messaging and conversation points.
Yeah, the messaging framework is what we're hoping to develop, and it just is to ensure that every time we start a conversation with the community, it has that same overarching message, probably something along the lines of, your coastal communities are an important part of our city that we treasure, but, the future is uncertain and we need to do some thinking about it. So that kind of consistency across all of the projects that are going to touch our coastal communities.
And obviously
It's
this is on summer as well, doesn't it?
Yes, oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that would be the other bit of feedback is going.
Yeah.
Sometimes areas feel like a bit of real, over consulted. There's wanting to know that, like, actually, we're a coastal community as a city. It's a big part of our.
Well, it is the whole of the district, the plan changes, all of the district limbs, are all of the district areas.
It's important that it is together. We need to figure out how to adapt to an uncertain future, and that it was all of us are in it together, rather than a you need to figure it out, or we're going to figure it out.
Be doing this to you.
Yeah, it's actually it is the future is unknown, but you have a really vital role in creating a more adapting to the future.
Yeah.
Joe.
Yeah, I think quite an important part of this conversation is the tracking data. And I think, like, our community has been waiting to see how we're tracking against these predictions.
Yes.
So I think it's really important to actually keep us updated and for people to actually see and realise, hey, this is happening. But, whether it's as fast or slower than what they think is really important to them.
Yes.
So Lisa, you.
Is there anything else that you think is useful for us to kind of understand as you work on the next part of this? Because I sort of kind of get it, but it's a lot to kind of get your head around in terms of the process. Is there anything that useful for us? People ask us questions about where we're at in the process. It's really around the initial scope, but we're not looking at doing things quickly would be the takeaway.
We've just finishing off a summary of what the plan change does and doesn't do.
Okay.
That's actually with Tessa now to review. So once that's gone again, this internal review, then we can pass that in as a draft again and say, do you think, is this plain language enough? Do you think people understand? It might be just the first thing, because it's been a while since plan change 12, it was a couple of years ago. And do we need to update our website information? Is there some things that we are doing? Is our website even user friendly? It's not. So again, there's a lot of work in that communication side of things. Planning made Planning 101 speak. Yeah, planners were terrible. Yeah. So there's that. There's certainly that. And then probably also what the Section 32,
Yeah.
maybe a bit about what we are investigating. So I really hope very soon we can explain the infrastructure assessment, because I do believe a lot of people will be very interested in what comes out of that and why are we asking these questions. So some of the things that we're delving down into is because we know at the moment the Section 32 is not fit for purpose. It needs a lot more work to us to be satisfied the fact that we have all the information. So we could do more bites of that.
And I won't ask them now, but I'm thinking about the infrastructure assessment because sounds like an interesting piece of work, but also looking at the status quo, how that will worrying that maybe something like Pages Road Bridge, if that's in a full state, are there any risks? Well, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's the criticality work. So there are other pieces of work in council again. Maybe that's because there is a lot of work. What's that thing with the duck? You know, heeling under here, but you see nothing, and then all of a sudden it's at flight, and then it's all sort of startling. So maybe it's trying to elevate some of that.
I think one of the other things, Celeste, is compared to, obviously we've tried to have this conversation with the community before and we did it badly by all accounts. It didn't land well. I think the really, the difference this time is the team the effort that the team is going to understand the impact that it's going to have on people. When you understand the impact, of course, you can manage people as human beings and work with them and for them much better because you know the context of what you're doing in that community. So I think that's a really
sounds positive. And if we had an opportunity to see some of the messaging with a few key residents, that might be helpful. If and when we come to that point, you're already probably with that plan, but way to check it out. Yeah, it's really interesting.
All right, Tim and then Yanni and then back to Joe.
I go back a few years. Remember Tessa?
Yeah, I do.
I supported the silent retreat because to me it made sense. But the question I have is, what legality will there be at the end of the day to a plan if governments and legal challenges are there?
Good question. It's we don't know the detail of legislative reform yet. We don't even know whether there'll be new powers. We don't know whether for example, when we move towards the signal is to move towards these spatial plans and some national, more national direction. We actually do not know what that might give councils potentially more powers, because at the moment, for example, only regional plans can take away existing use rights. But if they're going to be changing existing use rights, we don't know what that means, or district councils actually have powers to do that. But you only should really do that after you finish your adaptation planning. So that and everything's up for legal challenge. So that's just something we're very used to dealing with through this plan change. We certainly would anticipate, but we don't know what form that takes. So again, it's another reason.
Yeah.
Plan changes, a district plan or region never stays still. Don't know how we've been through, since I've been planning for 20 years, I've been through 3 district plan reviews and multiple plan changes.
We're up to 21.
Yeah, and even this plan change.
It's just been so much.
It is, yeah.
Not getting there.
One thing the government is signalling is trying to stop that constant churn, I think, of plan changes. So that has been acknowledged, the fact that takes a lot of.
As long as we get it right.
As long as you get it, well, that's true. And we always have a responsibility to monitor our policy, our plan. Is it effective? The question is the rule effective? I mean, that was the earlier matter raised. I mean, and so that's our job as planners, to go back and maybe we, at the end of this, we actually put a lot more effort into monitoring how effective our rules and policies are, and it might have some important things such as linked to how much is the sea level actually changing, might be sort of things, and how, is that actually impacting infrastructure. So and land use. So we might build into this at the end of this and say, actually, we're going to put our next effort into a monitoring program rather than just constant changes to the district plan.
All right, Yanni and then Joe.
Yeah, I mean, just some high-level feedback, which I've given before, but I get concerned that when we use the word coastal hazards, people just think of this as something that applies to the coast, when actually it goes way in places like Woolston, Linwood, probably. Yeah. But those communities wouldn't probably see themselves as coastal. So I guess just passing on, though, I think we do need to be really careful about the language that we use. And then also understand that, and a bit to Paul's point before, but in certain communities, their understanding of these issues won't be as good as some of the people that have been dealing with some of the other issues post-earthquake, and particularly around what we did last time. So yeah, just a plea really to consider the terminology as we try to explain it to people, and think about those communities that are impacted, that we might need to do a little bit more hands-on work in the local area to get people aware and understanding what's going on.
It's a really good shout.
Yeah, and certainly it's something Anita has particularly been looking at is the scope of the plan change in terms of hazard management, or where the risk is and where does it gets very blurred, as you just mentioned, and what should the scope of this plan change spatially be? So that is something, and we've raised the question, one of the options might be, do you need multiple different hazard layers? Can you just have a risk management area and it encompasses multiple hazards? Do you actually need to split them all out? If your management approach is just floor level, then it's just a floor, it doesn't necessarily, so that is something that we certainly, Anita's looking at.
Just anecdotally, from just a few local examples, but people are increasingly raising it with me. The new infill housing that's going in is leading to greater degrees of flooding. So I think the two developments now where when we've had, not overwhelming rain, but, moderate rainfalls, we can start to see the water going up people's driveways of these new developments. It just doesn't feel like with a brand new development, that's how stormwater should be working.
Shouldn't.
So I just wanted to raise the concern that, and again, it goes back to that monitoring and how well are we monitoring, but it did seem weird to me that where there's brand new developments, the ability for the stormwater to flow away instead of flow in doesn't seem to be working. And I've put them through CSR.
Have they? Okay, so that's something.
System, but yeah, I just raised that because it is a concern that people in those communities are raising with me, the impact of infill housing on the issues like flooding, for example.
So that is front of mind as well. The stormwater management team they've just still undertaking some new modelling to raise the inputs into the model for stormwater management to raise the impervious surface, because what we are aware of is that when they compact these sites, they compact them and they're no longer pervious. So there's still what models don't do well, or if at all, they make some assumptions about secondary flow paths. So water has to go somewhere. So it might find a new way. Now models, as much as they are great, they also have a lot of shortcomings too, or they just simply can't take into every impact. So those things are front of mind, and to date we haven't had that work, that evidence there, but that is actually being undertaken now, and when we get the results, that might be something we share as well.
Just one piece of feedback from me was just wondering around just the capacity. So where we've got high groundwater, I just don't know, is that a coastal thing? And what's the capacity, again, coming back to that high groundwater, more intensive housing, more compression, suddenly you've got, a really awful outcome in terms of flooding. So just wanted to raise, is there a piece of work that is being done in this around the coastal impact of the higher groundwater tables in certain areas and the intensification that's happening?
Yes, we're definitely looking at the dual influence of coastal hazards, meaning sea level rise and how it affects the groundwater and how it rises, and obviously that'll have an effect on flooding. Yeah, definitely.
And it may
inability
be
to drain stormwater.
Yeah. And it may be that actually we bring the stormwater management engineers in to speak to you, because that better them than us talking about and some of the results potentially of the new work or what's been.
Thank you.
Joe, been waiting patiently.
Yeah, just following on from what Yanni was saying too about the other affected areas in the city, and I brought this up last time, about how the coastal,
Plumes.
the little coastal strip that's actually on the hazard tool online, is very closed in, and there are hazards further away from that. And I feel that we get unfairly targeted in the coastal areas because, you know, people think it's just us, but it is the rest of the city, and especially next to the rivers.
Yeah.
But is that going to be included into this piece of work?
The mapping will be reflecting all the effects going, say, in areas like Woolston, Bromley, etc. So our mapping that will go into district plan showing the hazards of the areas subject to hazard rules will definitely reflect the extents, the full extent of
Will
those
it be under
areas.
PC12 or something?
Yes, it will be under PC12. At the moment, we are referring people to the Coastal Hazards online portal because it's online and it's easily available and you can zoom in on the property. But that was designed for the purposes of CHAP team, the Coastal Hazards Adaptation Planning. And their primary concern is the actual coast, our coast area. So they are not necessarily getting involved in areas such as Woolston and Bromley and that are around the estuary that are affected by coastal hazards, but equally they are affected by the river waters and groundwater. So it's all a combination of all the hazards put together.
When I was on the chat group on the BP one, they were developing the new risk tool. Is that part of the infrastructure assessment?
Yes, it'll feed into the infrastructure. So it's one of the tools that the infrastructure assessment will need to look to. So the infrastructure assessment is not developing any new hazard information, but for example, the Equilink updated groundwater reports, there's new information coming through as people do research, as monitoring. That's all sort of existing information that feeds into the risk scorer tool. And then that will be one of the ones that we usually.
Yeah, because I know that staff was saying that they had the council-owned infrastructure all mapped out as part of this tool.
Yes.
And that it could be available to public at some stage.
Some stage, yes.
But not for a while.
Yes, it's more, and I don't know if Jane Morgan's updated you about that or Mike Anderson. Really, it's making sure that the information is understood, what it's showing, how do you interpret it, make it so that the users are not misguided by using the tool, because there's an awful lot of information in there and it could actually could give rise to a lot of angst rather than being helpful. Yeah. So I think that they're very mindful of what does it mean. Like say if it goes red, what does that actually mean? If it says it's vulnerable, vulnerable under what conditions, so it's a lot of how, I guess the so user
bringing in the health being.
That's right. Well, I won't go so that far, but the user experience in terms of needs, that's what we've been briefed is they're working on that aspect.
So because this process might take quite a while, like I know people that are waiting for hopefully a garage to be added or a alteration.
Yeah.
What does it mean for those people? Can they go ahead and get their alterations?
Yes. So resource consent, just proceed as
There is the high and medium coastal hazard risk layer already in the plan, which will help assess any application, say for a garage, whether that area is subject to potential flooding resulting from sea level rise and say tsunami. Tsunami is probably not a major concern in terms of whether the garage should be dry or not, but it may matter for, say, dwelling additions. Do you want them to be relocatable? Do you want them to be solid for?
No, just know someone whose garage has been declined, but in this process, it may be okay to put a garage on.
Okay, so if you've got examples, I mean, we very much appreciate good examples too, if
Yeah,
there's things,
okay.
because I think
Yeah.
that helps us test things to say, we come back and say, look, small extensions really are, that's the risk on the landowner. Just be aware that, you might not, I don't know, in 50 or 80 years down the track, there might not be a sewer there. So if you are going to invest in your site, here's some options. Think wisely, because it may be sunk investment. So that's one of the economic assessments is what is the risk that a district plan signals that development is okay, that gives people the false perception that it might not be impacted in the future or will be able to be serviced. So considerations for sunk investment. It's your risk if you want to pour money into that property, or do you want to do it in more of a temporal sort of development that, for example, that's why relocatable buildings are good, because they means you can move it. You're not going to lose your complete investment in your property or your asset. So that's where that has a benefit, because so is there a way you might design it? So so this is
the
it's
people
about
that I'm thinking of are well aware of the risk.
Yeah.
And they're a bit, they feel like they're not going to have a risk for quite a long time, and that they're not really worried.
Yeah.
But it's like, why can't I?
And that's actually very much this point of discussion, socioeconomic impacts, because if that's not borne on ratepayers, so that's where the discussion becomes, if there's no risk to ratepayers, that's going to result in a cost, then is that something that the district plan needs to control or needs to manage in that way? And how much of a risk is that? Is it, is putting a garage on a site really a risk to the health and safety and well-being? I mean, or does it actually provide for use of that site until such time as bigger decisions are made? So that's why the plan change is really looking at what is really necessary to manage.
But it may affect insurance for the next person, though.
That's right. So we can't do anything about insurance. So insurance has its, but maybe there's some conversations that need to be had in parallel to this plan change about insurance. So some of these conversations, they might not strictly fall on the plan change, but it's a good discussion to have regardless. And ultimately, what we hope to achieve is people are more resilient or planning ahead. Out of all this process, maybe one of the best outcomes we came to was that people started planning ahead. They didn't fear it so much and really started, and that's got to benefit future generations. So maybe that's part of the conversation.
Planning ahead and decisions with eyes wide open.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So maybe those are some of the messaging that we actually start framing up. And what other support services could be alongside the plan change chat program that actually, maybe it's financial management, I don't know. Maybe those are the sort of things that we can.
I think where the rubber hits the road is we know that there's quite a few people in the community who don't have options. This is where their home is, and it is likely to be their home for the foreseeable, for the rest of their lives. And what does that mean? And I think it's understanding that is really important. People who have options, they can choose to sell and get out.
The whole with us, not to us process, it's really good.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We've got Greg and Tim.
Just picking up on something you guys said there. So what you'd be looking for is some real world case studies you can work with. So if Joe's able to pass on information or
absolutely
places, so you can get a real, this is it, rather than creating a scenario and not really having actually.
Absolutely. And we've been searching, so we did a search on the resource consents to try and see what's been consented, why was that consented, how did that get through the process, when we know that there's risk there, and so really wanting to understand that.
Yes, and I think overall, it's looking long term. So if a dwelling is on high enough piles or high enough temporary, if you like, foundation, rather than being on a concrete pad or raised through earthworks, then that will probably be okay for a good number of years, provided your road doesn't flood every second day and you are able to drain water, whether storm or wastewater. So we were quite surprised about a lot of consents being granted, but they are granted on the proviso that the buildings are relocatable.
So with the insurance, are we talking with insurers with this?
There has been some discussion in the past. We haven't had time or been at the right point in time to even have any more conversations. There's a lot of information out there about insurance and insurance retreat, and so there's been reports produced recently. I've seen some. There's been a lot of webinars as well, a lot of webinars available on insurance, and there's also been recommendations to central government about different approaches to insurance. I think it's got a term, I can't think of the term, sorry, right now, but insurance equity, or so there's a lot of information. I think maybe that might be something, whilst it's not our responsibility or we have limited control over that, maybe it's sharing some of that so people can be aware of.
I think we need to be aware of what insurers are thinking.
We know what they're thinking.
My biggest fear is one winter of rain and people get flooded, insurers are going to go, no more insurance. And then does your job have to speed up real quickly to cope with that? Or
so I think there's some good webinars to watch on that. Maybe I can see if we can get, if those have been recorded and are available. So they do talk about that. And it's not New Zealand insurers, it's some of the big, what are they called? The big multinational insurance. That's where
the underwriters.
The underwriters, it's what their decisions are actually influencing what happens in New Zealand. So there's, as I said, not best to talk about that.
One last question is, are we isolated in Christchurch, Canterbury, or we have another group that you work with as well for the whole of New Zealand?
There are other cities that are affected just as much. Oh, well, perhaps not just as much. Christchurch is the most affected by coastal hazards, the most vulnerable, but there are other cities that are doing it.
Yes, we do. Certainly the Ministry for the Environment did actually, they looked at how qualifying matters, that's more to do with Plan Change 14, how different councils approached it, and fair to say, differently. I think we're probably, we are advancing ours, I think, because we are the, kind of the most affected, so we don't have to do a lot of work in this space, but we are learning. There's lots of sharing going on.
It's really good. Lots of good questions. We still have a little bit more time for questions if anyone has them, but we did make sure we allocated.
Ask an out of the box question.
I don't know about that.
If we have another natural disaster like an earthquake and the land moves again, how does that impact?
I don't know.
I don't know. We're still moving after the last earthquakes.
Yes.
And unfortunately, yet again, it's the east that is suffering the most.
Yeah, so we could move up or down. Or
at the moment, the South Shore in particular is sinking at quite a substantial rate compared to, say, Waimarie Beach. It's about 7.5, 8 millimeters a year.
And that's the kind of data that the public need to see.
Yes.
And make sure it's accurate.
Yeah. So there's been further review work with because some of the model results didn't look right, so that went back and Jacobs did some further looking at that work. So yes, and that feeds into the I gave advice through Plan Change 14, it was sort of advised the fact that where that might have an impact on the plan change is something that was a medium hazard, medium risk, might end up being high risk, because obviously if it sinks more, the effect of sea level rise might be greater in that location, turning it, so really to do with the risk or the management areas, where do they fall? So that's something we need to consider, and but some further work through the chat program is actually progressing that we will utilise. So we are utilising some of the chat program work because that helps us establish our evidence base.
Thank you.
All right, Celeste.
I was interested to just if you give us a little bit more information about them. infrastructure report?
Yes.
When that might be, is there a timeline on that or?
Oh,
It's quite a big bit of work.
but big bit of work, and we were aiming to have sort of all, well,
I'm not gonna hold you.
September, October-ish.
Okay, and is that sort of, obviously just council infrastructure, so would it be roads?
Three waters and road,
Oh.
not community.
Okay, so
Infrastructure.
put up bridges and.
Yes, yes,
That's part of the road.
it.
There is another piece of work
Yeah.
though around the assets.
Yep.
For all hazards.
Yeah.
Not coastal hazards, but all hazards, so that's a separate. Yeah, which would involve the wastewater treatment.
One thing about the infrastructure assessment is it's a technical piece of work, so there's no engagement on it. It's a contracted, it works with, or it has a council technical team and a consultant team. It's a big technical, it gets completed before we can share the results at the end. So you won't see anything, but what I can share with you will be the nature of the scope of the work so that you understand that's been undertaken, because we have to go through the whole assessment before it produces things.
I think what I'm interested in is in a normal environment, doing an infrastructure report seems straightforward, but when you've got working through a climate impact assessment, when you've got earthquake legacy work to be completed, does that then have a negative impact on some of the future investment that, it's a chicken and egg thing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And that's what people have been talking about for years, and now we're at that kind of point, knowing the scope of that bit of work. Well, I'm curious to see the outcome of it, because it'd be great to see across this area an updated assessment. It is concerning given the time frame we're still looking at for things like the bridge.
Yes, yes. So we'll have to assume that that bridge is upgraded as planned, or any planned improvements, yes. So it has to assume that, because otherwise, so anything planned that's confirmed, it will say, so the criticality of that is just assumed as being improved.
And the other ancillary work.
Correct.
It's not technically, there's no timeline for any of that.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Tim?
One of the reasons I was against the stadium is because we're going to need billions of dollars for what we're talking about. What about the rubbish dump in Bexley, things like that? We have to do something with those, surely. We can't just go out to sea.
That's
yes. I think we need to be brutally honest.
It's been sped up, by the way. So the money for that remediation has been brought forward.
Wow. Yeah, so I think we need to be brutally honest with the ratepayers to say, this is the reality. When trigger points happen. Yeah.
I think when we talk about that messaging framework, obviously there's some really important messages for the most affected communities, and then there's that citywide stuff about, this is a collective. We deal with this collectively. Yeah.
Yes, but also it will be a lot of messages for our internal services
as well. Yeah.
Oh, you got another one? Yep.
No, I'm having another one. I'm being very, very greedy here.
No.
Just
we've
with
been
what
allocated
you
plenty
said
of
about
time.
the infrastructure assessment, and you said it's roads and water infrastructure. So when we were doing the check, they were talking about community halls and toilet blocks and everything. So is that not included?
No, not in the infrastructure assessment. It's probably challenging enough to do the three waters and roads. No, that's more for the coast adaptation planning work. I mean, the only matter that might come into with Plan Change 12 is that if we think that the district plan needs to manage, in other words, remove enablement of such activities, but I don't think it will be justified enough to do that, because communities still need to be able to provide for their community well-being and some of those activities. But whether they're managed more strictly in some locations, that could be something. Maybe we don't propose any big community halls or provide for them or have much stricter assessment matters for establishing a new community hall in some locations, but that we may not even need to.
Okay, so that's similar for like libraries and swimming pools and stuff.
We're not looking at existing use rights. We can't look at existing use rights. at this stage under the scope of this plan change. It's
the new one, yeah.
might be expansion though, if you're going to
Yeah.
extend it, that's new development, that's new activities, and that's where the district plan does have management.
But I think with the aim of trying to have that conversation as close as possible
Yeah.
all at once with the community, hopefully it'll feel joined up. We're talking about roads and we're talking about water and we're talking about your local assets at the same time we have a plan.
So anything that's going through the process at the moment, for planning to do with our, earthquake legacy work, that may not happen because of the plan change or will continue to happen?
No, I mean, it's under the current rules. And so there are existing rules in there that deal with floor levels or manage floor levels. So a building will need to be set at a certain, you've seen a development across the road. It's all
Just
set
thinking
at the
about
floor
like
levels.
roading
also.
and,
Yeah. There's nothing yet that would change any of that. I mean, that will come down to connections, council will put conditions on connections into the sewer, into this, council system. So all of that risks are managed either, at different stages of the process or through subdivision consent or, so that's all land use consent. But at the moment, there's little to decline an application.
So, yeah, we may be adding to the assessment matters
Yeah.
for resource consents so that more attention is being given to those risks associated with coastal hazards and associated other hazards. And also just a word when it comes to the community infrastructure, your holes, etc. The existing ones we can't really shift or move unless there is a desire to move them or upgrade them. Instead of upgrading them in the spot where they are at risk, they would say, if you move 300 meters down this road, you are outside of the coastal hazard risk area. So it doesn't mean that the communities will be stripped of all the infrastructure that they have. They will have the existing one. It's the vulnerable new ones that we would be suggesting that they are located just outside of the area, and a lot of them will be close by.
so would, the red zone proposed fringe housing, even though it's not in the coastal area, actually come under PC 12?
Not unless they are in the coastal hazards area.
It's lucky they are, right?
Pardon?
It's lucky they are, right?
Some of
The
them.
next, a lot of it's next to the river, but yeah, that's one, yes. Yeah, okay.
All right,
All done.
I think that's us. Thank you very much,
Okay.
and
Thank you.
for responding so fully and fulsomely to all of our questions, and and for providing us lots of time. So appreciate it.
It's interesting and
very
beautifying.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm particularly nervous about the proposed extension of existing use rights. So, but that's out of all of our hands. All right, thank you. We will just do our karakia whakamutunga. Kia tau, te rangi mārie e, o te rangi e tu iho nei, o papatuanuku e taku tōnei, o te taiao e awhi nei, i runga i a tātou, tihei mauriwa. Thanks everyone.